Imagine being strapped between two wooden boats, your skin exposed to the sun, your limbs splayed out so you cannot move, and then your captors begin to feed you milk, honey. They force it down your throat. They pour it over your body. And then they wait. Within hours, insects arrive. Flies, wasps, maggots emerging from the decomposing food. They burrow into your skin. They lay eggs in your flesh. They eat you alive from the inside out. And you cannot move. You cannot scratch. You cannot do anything but feel yourself being consumed by creatures no bigger than a grain of rice. This torture has a name. It is called Scaphism, and it may be the most sadistic execution method ever devised by human hands. Welcome back to Cruel Histories. Today we explore a torture so extreme, so grotesquely detailed in historical accounts, that modern scholars still debate whether it was real or merely the product of ancient imagination run wild. The term Scaphism comes from the Greek word scaphe, meaning boat or trough. The torture itself is recorded in only one major historical source, the writings of Plutarch, a Greek historian and philosopher who lived from 46 to 120 AD. In his biography of the Persian king Artaxerxes II, Plutarch describes the execution of a man named Mithridates, and he provides a level of gruesome detail that has haunted historians for nearly 2,000 years. According to Plutarch's account, Scaphism was a Persian execution method reserved for the worst crimes, the worst betrayals, the crimes that demanded not just death, but obliteration, not just of the body, but of the soul. The process began with the selection of two wooden boats, typically shallow-bottomed vessels designed for river transport. The condemned prisoner was stripped naked. His wrists and ankles were bound to the edges of the boats, one limb tied to each vessel. His torso was exposed between the two hulls. The boats were then positioned so that the prisoner's exposed body was suspended between them, unable to move in any direction. He was trapped. He was helpless. But he was not yet being tortured. That came next. The victim was then forced to consume an enormous quantity of milk and honey. Plutarch describes the process as the prisoner being force-fed until his stomach could barely contain any more. Then the captors would cover his body, his face, his arms, his legs, his genitals, with a mixture of milk and honey. They would anoint him in it. They would make sure every inch of exposed skin was coated, and then they would place the boats in water and wait. What happened next was deliberate, calculated, and scientifically cruel. The milk and honey attracted insects. Flies arrived first, drawn by the sweet smell of the dairy and the sugar. They landed on the prisoner's body and began to feed. But flies were only the beginning. As the milk began to ferment and the honey began to attract other creatures, the ecosystem of death grew more complex. Wasps arrived, beetles, and most horrifyingly blowflies, the flies that lay eggs in rotting flesh. These eggs would hatch into maggots within hours, and the maggots would burrow into the prisoner's skin, eating the living tissue beneath. Plutarch's account describes the prisoner being covered in maggots, not just on the surface, but burrowing into his flesh, creating tunnels of infection. The prisoner's skin would begin to rot while he was still alive. His wounds would become gangrenous. Infection would spread through his body. But here's where Scaphism becomes truly diabolical. The torture was designed to last as long as possible. The prisoner was kept alive. He was given water to drink. His wounds were treated, just enough to prevent death from infection or dehydration. The torture was designed to maximize suffering, while minimizing the possibility of a quick death. Plutarch describes the specific case of Mithridates, a Persian noble who had committed some unnamed crime. Artaxerxes II. Mithridates was subjected to Scaphism in the year 401 BC. According to Plutarch, the torture lasted 17 days. 17 days. Imagine lying immobilized between two boats for 17 days. Imagine insects burrowing into your skin for 17 days. Imagine the progressive gangrenous rot of your own flesh. Imagine the smell. Imagine the agony. Imagine knowing that on day 1 you still have 16 days to go. Plutarch describes Mithridates begging for death. He describes the prisoner screaming so much that his voice gave out. He describes a man who had been reduced to something less than human, a living repository of suffering, kept alive solely to suffer more. On the 17th day, Mithridates finally died. Plutarch does not specify the cause. It may have been blood poisoning from the gangrenous wounds. It may have been dehydration, despite the water he was given. It may have simply been that his body could no longer sustain the damage. But after 17 days of being consumed alive by insects, Mithridates was finally dead. Now, here is where modern historians become skeptical. The level of detail in Plutarch's account is almost too precise. The 17-day duration, the specific description of maggots and decay, the exact process of force-feeding milk and honey. Some scholars have argued that Plutarch was embellishing, that he was writing drama rather than history, that Scaphism may never have actually been used as an execution method, but rather was a philosophical thought experiment, a way of imagining the worst possible torture. Others argue that Plutarch was reporting what he had heard from reliable sources, that Scaphism was indeed a real Persian execution method, but one so rarely used and so horrifying that only fragmentary accounts survived, that the level of detail suggests eyewitness testimony or records that have since been lost. What we know is this: the ancient Persians were sophisticated in their understanding of torture. They understood psychology. They understood how to inflict maximum suffering. They had access to the biological knowledge needed to weaponize insects, and they had the will to implement such methods. Ancient sources describe other Persian tortures that were definitely real. But there is another possibility. Plutarch may have been describing not a real torture method, but a mythical one. A legendary punishment so terrible that it was used in stories to illustrate the concept of ultimate suffering. A torture that was too extreme to be real, and yet too vivid to be forgotten. What is certain is that Scaphism, whether real or legendary, became one of the most famous torture methods in history. It was cited by later historians. It was referenced in philosophical texts. Medieval writers used Scaphism as an example of pagan cruelty, and in modern times it has become a touchstone for discussions about the limits of human cruelty. In 2011, a modern journalist and torture expert named Mark Bowden researched whether Scaphism would actually work as described. He consulted entomologists, insect experts. He reviewed the biology of flies and maggots, and his conclusion was that yes, Scaphism would work exactly as Plutarch described. The insects would come, the maggots would burrow, the gangrenous rot would spread, the victim would survive the process for days or even weeks, experiencing what might be the most prolonged agony imaginable. Scaphism teaches us something darker than most torture methods teach. It shows us that ancient people were not primitives who used torture casually. They were scientists of suffering. They understood the biological processes of decay and insect behavior. They understood how to use nature itself as a weapon. They understood that the worst tortures are not the quickest, but the slowest, the ones that stretch suffering across days and weeks. If the horror of Scaphism has gripped you, if you find yourself horrified and fascinated by the lengths humans will go to inflict suffering, please hit that like button. It helps bring these dark histories to viewers who want to understand the darkest chapters of human existence. And if you want more episodes exploring ancient torture methods, Persian cruelty, and the ingenious ways humans have devised to maximize suffering, subscribe now and ring the notification bell so you never miss a story. Tell me in the comments, do you believe Scaphism was real, or was Plutarch spinning a philosophical horror story? And which torture method from this series has disturbed you the most? I read every comment, and your theories shape future episodes. Next episode, we descend into ancient Mesopotamia. Until next time, remember, history is not always written in ink. Sometimes it is written in blood, and sometimes the worst chapters are the ones that actually happened.